Good afternoon and welcome to today's event. It's the Coleman Burke Center's last event of the semester. Thank you all for coming, especially those of you who are starting to worry about the exams that are rapidly approaching. But it's my pleasure today to invite you to today's event on building authentic pathways for environmental justice advocacy with Aubrey Connor, who is Director of Environmental and Climate Justice at the NAACP. She's on the faculty at UC Davis Environmental Policy and Management Program, and is very active in doing work in this space, helping define what we mean by environmental justice, trying to make it a reality. She and I were on a program together, I guess it was a year ago, and it made me think it would be great to have her come spend some time in Cleveland and meet students and share her work with all of you. Some of you know she was originally supposed to be here in January, but given the nature of her work, that she's based in California and the fires that ravaged much of the state earlier this year, we agreed to postpone it, and we were so glad she was able to make it back. I know you're not here to listen to me, so without any further ado, I'm really pleased to be able to turn the podium over to Aubrey for her remarks today.
Thank you so much, Professor Adler, for inviting me and for allowing me to talk with you all a little bit about my work and what is going to, in my opinion, be a battle that we all are going to need to be a part of together. Okay, so I just want to start with kind of what I plan to cover today. So first, there's a lot of different definitions for what environmental and climate justice means. So we'll talk a little bit about that, the history of environmental and climate justice, what are different ways that communities actually engage in this work and different strategies. What are we going to do now that the landscape is changing? I feel like that is the million-dollar question, and some takeaways. So let's start with how do we define environmental and climate justice. So I actually want this to be a little bit interactive, so I'd love for you to turn to someone near you and discuss, what you think of when you think of environmental and climate justice. So as two different definitions, and then in a couple minutes, I would love to hear what you all discussed with your neighbor.
Oh, we do? Sorry.
So how do we define it?
Also, just stay well rounded.
I always think environment to be whereas climate is more specific. Efforts to decarbonize, reduce the impact of fossil fuel emissions, and all of the negative impacts of that. But like flip, all those instances where it's more so like pollutants, harmful to human health or to the climate or dignity, but not necessarily tied.
When I think of environment, I think
You think it's more remedial or redistributive?
I'm not, I know those have specific.
Well, so like, is it about, like when I think of something like Flint, here's a dramatic inequality, dramatic injustice, and so we can feel this injustice perhaps trying to remediate those inequalities.
yes.
When I think about also that injustice resulting from resources. Is one way to think about so I thought about climate. Given
All right, so we'll come back together in like 20 seconds. So I would love to actually hear one or two definitions of how people thought about environmental justice. I heard some, so I know that you have thoughts. You could just shout it out.
So I was thinking,
For the screen, please. For the YouTube screen, get your microphone. Thank you.
So I was thinking of the justice side and was thinking of what historically redlining and that whole process means that now some segments of our population live in poor climate areas.
That's a good, redlining is definitely an incredibly important part of environmental justice. Thank you for that. And just for time, maybe we'll hear what someone thought of when they thought of climate justice.
Yeah, we were talking about how wealthier countries have contributed more to warming the planet, and poorer countries have contributed less but suffer greater consequences.
No, absolutely. Like the climate that the people who are bearing the brunt of the climate decisions aren't necessarily the people who have been centered in the decision making. So here's a couple possible definitions, and the first one, as it relates to environmental justice, tends to be one that's more utilized when we think about like policy making work. And it really covers kind of thinking about the fair treatment of all people, different categories, some of them protected, some of them not under the law, but how those individuals are able to interact with the law and with policy. And also having meaningful involvement in the processes that actually impact them. Another definition, I don't have it on there, but another definition I like to think about is the ability to eat, live, and play in a community without barriers to being able to participate in those activities. And then climate justice is kind of what we think about as it relates to climate change, global warming, who's able to actually participate in the decisions as it relates to climate change that's happening within the country, across the world, as well as who is the most responsible and the least responsible for the greenhouse gas emissions that are actually impacting our climate and communities more specifically. So when we think about, for example, our severe and our frequent natural disasters that are happening more in certain communities, I think of climate justice as well, right? Because we know that the increase of greenhouse gas emissions in particular places leads to more global warming, then leads to more frequent and severe natural disasters in certain places. So I'm going to bring up a topic that, especially now in this country, seems to be much more controversial, and it's around centering communities, specifically when we think about environmental and climate justice work. And what my goal is by the end of this slide is to explain why it's important for us to center historically excluded communities, as opposed to talking about environmental and climate justice as something that will benefit us all, hopefully. So my thought as it relates to centering Black communities specifically is because Black communities have typically been excluded despite the research that we have that demonstrates that there's a disproportionate impact of environmental and climate hazards in Black communities. And so even though we have toxic waste and race that came out in the late 1980s, the same study done by the United Church of Christ 20 years later that demonstrated that Black communities, communities of color, were more likely to be siting sites for toxic waste incinerators. These communities continue to not necessarily be at the decision-making table or really, quite frankly, a part of the solutions when it comes to environmental and climate justice solutions. And when we think about the solutions that do sometimes end up in those communities, they're not originating from Black folks or historically excluded communities. So think of, for example, a group that's like, we're doing environmental and climate justice work. And then they, have different folks at the table, not necessarily from the community. They come up with this model or this solution, and then they go to the community and they say, hey, let's implement this because we think that this would be really great for you all to be able to implement and to do in order to fix the problem that you have been dealing with for decades and potentially centuries. And lastly, that there are systemic barriers to participation in general. So now a lot more communities are starting to see some of the barriers to participation because of the administration that we're under, as it relates to lack of resources, as it relates to not being able to be at the decision-making table. But Black communities have faced these challenges for a number of years. So for some of this, it's not necessarily new, it's just being exacerbated. And my case is that oftentimes Black communities have been resilient despite not necessarily having any resources, not being at the table, making their own table, creating solutions to be able to try to continue to be able to persevere despite all of the challenges that have shown up in their communities. And so if we actually start with solutions based in communities that have already been thinking about these issues innovatively, that have already had to come up with a lot more with a lot less, then we will actually have innovation that will not only help Black communities, historically excluded communities, but we can also model those solutions in other communities as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of how we got here, and some of y'all's definitions touch on this because I think that it's really important for us to understand the history, especially right now, to make sure that we don't repeat some of the problems and some of the missteps that have happened in the past. So when we think about like the environmental and climate kind of movement, oftentimes people think to 1970s. But really, when we think about the environmental and climate justice movement, a lot of it birthed from the civil rights and racial justice movement in the 1960s. So the understanding that Black folks, people who were in historically excluded communities, were not actually able to participate in a lot of the protections in this country the way that others were. And so there was already kind of this recognition that that existed. And then in the 1970s was when there was also this movement that began to say, well, we actually also need to make sure that we're protecting our planet and the people who are in it. So then we had this civil rights movement that was moving like this, and an environmental and conservation movement that was moving like this. And they weren't necessarily coming together. And so at the time, even though some of the early conversations around environmental and climate issues were about including all people, there was also this conversation around NIMBYism. And so we talked about redlining before, but I do want to focus a little bit on NIMBYism because I think that it is really important to understand the history to make sure that we don't end up back there again. And so that was a movement of people understanding that we needed to have protections, that there were environmental hazards that existed, but they just wanted to make sure that those hazards did not actually live in their communities. Didn't necessarily matter where they went, but just don't keep it here. And so where a lot of those toxic waste incinerators, where a lot of that contaminated soil, where a lot of these hazards would end up were in places that were redlined. So all of this kind of came together to perpetuate the environmental hazards that already existed in a lot of Black frontline and fence line communities. And so in the 80s was really when we kind of started to finally see a national movement. And it's not to say that there weren't communities talking about environmental and climate justice issues before then, but that was when we saw in Warren County this national uprising because this Black community was going to have to keep all of this contamination in their community. The state had agreed to it. The EPA at the time said it was fine. And you had this Black community stand up and say, we're no longer going to be a sacrifice zone for environmental hazards. And so we saw for the first time civil rights organization, the NAACP was there. You saw organizers and activists from many different spaces, the labor movement, and other spaces come together to help this community to show that the environmental and climate space could actually coincide with the civil rights and a racial justice movement. And so it was a really important time because it helped to create this momentum to then allow for there to be more research that was done. An executive order in the early 90s under the Clinton administration to highlight that there should be a recognition that the White House and the federal government should indeed be thinking about environmental justice at that level. And it helped to kind of solidify that environmental justice was something that shouldn't necessarily just live with the people who are most harmed to be talking about, but that we all could benefit from those conversations. And then we had Hurricane Katrina. We're coming up, this is the 20th anniversary of Hurricane Katrina this year. And that was a time where people, even though we were having conversations about environmental and climate justice, but people started to really understand what climate justice meant, and also how climate justice intersected with the emergency management space and the inequities that existed for this community to be able to rebuild, who had access to the most resources to rebuild and who didn't get access to any resources. And so we started to see more people talking about environmental climate justice with the natural disaster kind of intersection and understanding the importance of talking about emergency preparedness within that context as well. We made a lot of strides for some time in the environmental and climate justice space. We had Justice 40, which was a framework that actually it tried to ensure that states, once they received funding, that there was this equity kind of framework of how they were actually distributing funds. And we had our first federal government website that was dedicated specifically to environmental justice. We'll talk a little bit later about where some of all of that lives, but that was something that was a major change from where the environmental and climate justice movement started, of not even being centered at all. So Dr. Ben Chavis used to lead the NAACP, and he helped to coin the term environmental racism. And he was there in Warren County when the protests were happening, and he was one of the first people that really highlighted that we can't necessarily talk about environmental and climate issues without also talking about a racial justice component. And so the NAACP, for example, has been a part of environmental and climate justice issues from the beginning because of the recognition and understanding that we see environmental and climate justice issues as civil rights and racial justice issues, and we see them as interconnected, and that you can't necessarily talk about any other issues without also talking about environmental and climate justice issues. So these are the pillars of work that I work on with our branches and our state conferences. So I'm going to talk a little bit throughout the presentation about some of the work that I'm doing, but then also some of the work that our partners are doing, just so that you can have a sense of like how we build out our strategies, as well as how some of our partners have built out their strategies as well. So we focus on 4 areas: zero emissions, sustainable communities. That is a picture with our state conference president when I was in East Palestine for the train derailment, and working alongside them in the branches there to come up with some solutions for issues that we were seeing. Energy democracy and a right to toxic-free environment. So the first thing I want to talk about is just the trends in the increase of natural disasters in Black communities. So the National Climate Assessment, which hopefully we'll continue to have, but we'll see, has been really instrumental in highlighting what the observations of where natural disasters are likely to happen, where flooding is more likely to happen, as well as what communities can expect in the future. And we've seen an increase, not surprisingly, of natural disasters in Black communities, as well as an increase in the frequency. This is actually a slide that I pulled straight from the 5th National Climate Assessment. So it highlights that we're all going to be impacted by climate change. But one of the things that we know is that Black communities are going to be more likely to face flooding, which we're seeing, than any other community in this country, as well as the fact that we're going to just see more extreme weather in general. So it's going to behoove us all to really think about what some of this means. And as we'll talk a little bit about later, in order for us to continue to have the information to kind of understand what the trends are going to look like, if we have a change in how our federal government funds this type of work in order to ensure that people understand the trends, is also going to take us recognizing our power and being able to gather that data and be able to create those predictions ourselves. So I was supposed to come here earlier this year, but it was literally at the beginning of the LA wildfires that were happening in Altadena, Pasadena, in LA proper. And one of the things that we noticed kind of right away was that there was a lot of attention on the Palisades. There was a lot of attention in certain parts of LA. And honestly, if you didn't live in California, you would think that there was only probably one wildfire. There were 2. And so the messaging just wasn't like focused on some of the communities who were also impacting, who are also experiencing the impact of the wildfires, as well as they just weren't getting the resources. So there was a wildfire with Edison, which we're litigating right now currently. So that's with the utility company, and then potentially starting a wildfire, as well as the wildfire that came from more natural issues. And so what we were hearing from communities right away was that there were town halls, there were people who were giving money to GoFundMe, there were companies who were literally donating and pledging money, but just to very specific parts of LA. And so they were really nervous because then the messaging became, well, everybody there has a lot of money. So like, why do we care that much about the wildfires in LA? It's just a bunch of celebrities. We don't need to help them. And it just wasn't true. So some of the people who I met with in Altadena, they may have had a house, but it was a house that had been in their family for generations. And that was the only wealth that they had. Some of them, they may have been, they may have been someone who was renting out a property, but that's really their only source of income. Some of the individuals that they didn't have other ways to be able to retrieve really important documents or information. And quite frankly, most of the people there have never experienced a wildfire to that extent. So even walking through with them some of the things that I typically will do with our other branches and our state conferences when a disaster would hit, we had to start way further back because they've never had to apply for FEMA assistance, and they've never had to think about an SBA loan or how a GoFundMe account may impact their assistance that they get or what Red Cross actually does. And so it was really important in thinking about the strategies for the wildfire to, one, recognize the audience that we were actually meeting with and making sure that our messaging actually reflected the communities that we were hoping to reach. So that was part one. The other part was also thinking about, a lot. So there was so much misinformation. And so part of what I spent my day doing was literally just on the phone with FEMA, on the phone with, different companies being like, hey, we're hearing this. Can you all, create something to demonstrate this is not the case? So one of the things that people were saying was that you had to pay back all the money that FEMA gave you. And people really believed that. They were like, well, I'm not going to apply for FEMA assistance because I don't have to pay back all the money. So just helping people to understand that that wasn't the case, but they also, at that time, wanted to hear it from the federal agency that was supposed to be giving them the assistance. Working with GoFundMe, because there was so much misinformation around what a GoFundMe page needed to look like. And so we were working with private entities and companies and helping them to understand their role in what this looked like for communities who were impacted. They also had their own fund. Where is their money going? So a lot of the work was making sure that the equity components were a part of that. We then realized that so FEMA has these things called disaster resource centers, and there are these places where people are supposed to be able to go and get all this information and be able to understand what to do next, and that's it. But typically, that is the way that those resource centers are built is not necessarily built with those who have been traumatized by a natural disaster in mind. It can feel almost overwhelming to individuals, and at the time, there wasn't one at all in Altadena. So then people had to travel to get information that they were going to be overwhelmed by, and then hopefully be able to get something that would be helpful for them at that time. So part of what I did in hearing from our branches at our state conference and some of the community members was actually work to build a disaster resource center in Altadena. So we were able to help them to think about where are some of the places that they are not reaching, and Altadena was one of them. And so now there's a disaster resource center there. But we also were like, well, we also need to create these opportunities for people to get information from us because people saw us as a trusted source of information. And so we had our own resource kind of town halls as well, where we invited individuals from different federal agencies, from different nonprofits to come and share with people what we kind of felt like was probably the most pressing information for them to know at that phase of recovery. And so we've done many of those and looked at what was needed at different phases of recovery and then invited people based on that. Part of the work was also identifying some of the things that, while we were working with federal agencies, I've done enough work with federal agencies to know that sometimes they're going to just share the information that they feel is most useful for them and maybe not necessarily share some of the information that they don't want to necessarily talk about as much publicly. And so that was, part of the work was having conversations with the Army Corps, with EPA around cleanup. Where is this contaminated soil going to go? Are you providing, PPE to the communities that are near some of these sites? Where is the actual site going to be? Where once you do the cleanup, where are you taking everything to after that? And so those were all considerations that have gone into the LA wildfire work, and that some of it is, more work that we're doing behind the scenes, and some of it is work that, of course, we're doing outwardly in communities. We also developed, this actually was something I developed last year because I, to some extent, anticipated that this year was going to have a lot more natural disasters, but because of the wildfires, we were able to add some more information to it, and so we designed a disaster resiliency hub where it has different natural disasters based on the National Climate Assessment that are most likely to impact Black communities. It has information on there that highlights, what that intersection looks like with Black and frontline communities, as well as kind of some of the high-level next steps that people can think about as it relates to all of the natural disasters that we have on there, whether it relates to like environmental issues, to housing issues, to insurance, a number of different things that we hear about across the country. So now I want to show a video that highlights how I sit on the advisory council for this group, Counterstream Media, and they're doing some really interesting work where they're utilizing narrative storytelling to help with mobilization. And so I want to show this clip.
When you know your story, you know who you are, and you know whose you are. I've heard of a solidarity ride in the 60s, but I thought that's something that expired.
Solidarity Rise is a concept that looks to build power. We call it a solidarity ride versus a toxic tour because a toxic tour we feel is extractive. A solidarity ride means that we're going to come back together and we're going to build solidarity together. We're going to problem solve. We're going to learn from each other.
We are Cancer Alley in Missouri County 3-4. It's in the water. It's in the air. It's in the soil. It is a global crisis. And that's the reason why it's so important, no matter where you go, keep talking about it. It's picking up. It's picking up steam.
Go to your EPA. Start asking questions. I'm telling you right now, you have a whole housing project of people that are angry and they show up to the city manager's office or the mayor's office. The mayor will be like, hey, I got 48 people at my back. Like, what's up? And then you get more and more people move as a movement. So solidarity is correct.
It behooves us to understand that we are not just a single conversation. It's no different from the Gulf South to Appalachia to the Midwest, the Congo, everywhere.
So I wanted to show this clip to highlight another kind of way that advocates are utilizing a different strategy in order to bring communities together. So they're really building on some of the principles of the civil rights movement and using that to build storytelling and to actually show to people, here are the issues that are happening in our communities. And one of the things that I really like about the Solidarity Rides is that it's obviously led by people from frontline and fence line communities. And then that's an opportunity for other individuals to want to be a part of this larger movement as well. So we also have done a lot of work as it relates to water. So I'm going to talk a little bit about first the work that we did around the lead copper rule, because how we looked at this work, the way that we've been working on lead copper rule issues for a long time. But what I wanted to do was to have people have different ways that they can engage on lead copper rule revisions and not make it seem so technical for individuals, so the only people who would want to engage are people who are in the policy making space, or lawyers, or people who are thinking about kind of the technical aspects of it. So part of what we did when we engaged in this campaign was to actually create a petition. And this was a way for people to leave like a very short public comment for the EPA as it related to lead copper rule. We toyed around with the idea of, do we want to, just give people a template and then expect for them to go and submit that? And ultimately, I was like, I don't think people are going to do that. I think if they have to take one extra step, then people might be like, I'll get back to that later. So we had a conversation with a celebrity around the time, and at that time, we were able to talk about water issues. We had this petition that was running, and then with our state conferences and our branches, the people who I knew who were more engaged in the issue, we had a webinar, and we were able to go into more of the technicalities of what a change in the lead and copper rule would mean at the state level for each of our states. And what was really important about that was that we were also able to have each of our state conferences to submit public comments to the EPA around the lead copper rule. Before we actually engaged in the campaign, we had kind of thought through what's the likely outcome, and we had an idea of what our opposition was going to look like. So it was really important for us to be able to have voices from across the country who were able to talk to the importance of keeping the lead copper rule revisions interim rule where they were and to potentially strengthen them if possible. And so we had 20 state conferences to submit public comments, in addition to over 1,000 individuals submitted public comments through this petition that we built online. And we submitted one at a national level as well. And what was really important to me around how we were able to do this campaign, we were working with other environmental and conservation organizations, but what we really wanted to lead with was the racial justice, the civil rights component to this work, and that helped to make this issue resonate with our communities and with the people who we were working with. And our state conferences were able to add their own personal stories or things that they were seeing in their state into those public comments as well. So we do work, like I said, at the policy level. We do work with our state conferences, but we also do demonstrations. We stand in solidarity with our coalition partners at marches and rallies. We don't necessarily think that that is something that we should completely give away and not do. And so we participated in the March to End Fossil Fuels. And what was really important for us in engaging in this work was that we were hearing from particularly the leaders of the March to End Fossil Fuels kind of coalition, that this was the way that younger folks wanted to engage on this issue. And so for us, it's not necessarily only about us bringing our solutions, but it's also about us standing in solidarity with other organizations and coalitions who have ideas about how we're going to create a more sustainable planet moving forward. So there were over 500 organizations that were there. It was one of the largest environmental and climate demonstrations at that time. And so it was really successful in bringing more attention to the issue and also demonstrating across racial, cross-generational, intersectional demonstration for why our planet does not need to continue to add fossil fuels to our everyday life. However, one of the things that we have noticed is that when it comes to legal strategies, there are a lot of equity issues with who has access to lawyers and who has access to the ability to bring certain complaints, or which complaints are given the most weight in the environmental and climate space. And so even though this is something that, again, we have kind of known for many years that there are folks who are fighting for environmental and climate issues, when it comes to a justice component or equity component, there are fewer folks in the legal space who are willing to step up and to be able to ensure that they're helping community members as well. And so actually I want to show this video which highlights some of the work that we did with the Jackson water crisis, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of our strategies with this, because we utilized policy and legal strategies and congressional strategies for this campaign. Our testimony was really important to highlight that Black people cannot be left behind whenever it comes to investments from the federal government. We're here in Jackson, Mississippi at the failed water treatment plant, where we know that residents have been without clean water for months. But we cannot wait any longer. Because the state has waited so long to give resources to residents here, we're at almost $2 billion for what it will take to actually have clean water here in Jackson.
It's not fair to say that this is a Black administration problem. It's a problem that had existed long before Blacks were elected. This is not about being Republican, it's not about being Democrat, it's about people. You want the best for your people.
So, when we were working on the Jackson water crisis, and the irony of that was that I had started maybe a couple weeks before, and then the water crisis hit, and everyone was like, okay, what are we gonna do? I went to Jackson, and there were some folks who were talking about, like, let's do demonstrations, let's do marches, and I was like, that's really important, and I also want to hear from the community members and see where there are gaps in the strategies. So what I heard when I was meeting with community members was that folks had known for decades that there was something off about the water. So nobody drank tap water in Jackson. People only drank bottled water. And that had been the case for a long period of time. That one of the former mayors had actually written to the governor, and he understands, architecture. He understood that the pipes were too small in order to support the water infrastructure in Jackson. And so that was back in the 90s when he wrote to the governor for more support. And he had been an advocate for many years after that, saying this water infrastructure and the water treatment plant is going to fail the residents if we don't do something soon. So there were these decades and decades of disinvestment that had happened into Jackson's water infrastructure. And so it wasn't something that just happened, a few years ago, and it was like, oh my gosh, it froze and then it got hot and now we have a water crisis. No, this was an intentional disinvestment in the community there. And so when I realized that they had done all this work ahead of time for decades to try to highlight this issue, one of the things that I wanted for us to be able to highlight was their work in a space that would allow for there to be amplification of the issues that they had been trying to raise in other forms. So they had been marching, they had been protesting, and not to say that work ended, but I felt that it was important for us to look at what were some of our legal and policy strategies that we could implement. So one of the strategies was actually going on Capitol Hill and taking the stories from the individuals there. So not just testifying, but testifying with the understanding and with the stories specifically from community members. So we weren't going there and making up solutions. We went there with understanding. And so when I went back into communities, they're like, yes, Abray, that is exactly what's happening. Like, thank you so much for saying that in front of Congress for us. We did that at a time where, and with a committee that we knew could hopefully be able to move some immediate investment and resources to the city of Jackson. And so we were able to get some immediate funds that were moved to Jackson, as well as a couple months later, we were able to get another $600 million moved to Jackson as it relates to their water infrastructure issues there. But also with those stories, I felt that it was important for us to be able to have something legally existing that amplified the stories of community members. So we decided to file a Title VI complaint with the EPA at the time. It was strategically soon after their Office of External Civil Rights and Environmental Justice was just opened. And so at the time it felt that it was important for that office to have to create a model of what their work needed to look like in communities moving forward. And given the track of all the things that the community members in Jackson had done, we wanted this office to be accountable to community members. So we filed it. We also filed it with them specifically to say we want them to be involved in next steps. And one thing about Title VI administrative complaints is that you don't necessarily need to include community member, exhibits or affidavits and things like that. But I felt that it was really important for our complaint that we had their narratives actually highlighted, even if they weren't complainants. One, because this was another opportunity to amplify the stories, as well as for it to be on record, like what people were saying at a local level. Another thing that we did once our complaint was actually open was we invited the headquarters office of the EPA to actually come to Jackson and have roundtable conversations with community members so that they could actually see the people who they were going to be deciding whether or not there was an administrative complaint decision in their favor or not. We were making really good headway with our complaint. And then Louisiana decided to drop this complaint called Louisiana v. EPA, which many people have probably heard of. And so around the same time where we were making strides with the EPA, you have a neighboring state that decided that communities should not be involved in the process. And then Mississippi decided to file a response to the EPA that nearly mirrored the language that was in Louisiana v. EPA in their complaint. So obviously we can't say one way or another whether or not it was indicative of what the next steps were. However, at that time, the EPA then decided to issue a ruling, very long, that basically said they didn't have enough information to decide one way or another if there was racial discrimination in the funding scheme. So, a few weeks later, the EPA's Office of Inspector General issued a finding that the state actually could have been more helpful in Jackson's water infrastructure issues, and that if they had actually helped with some of the funding allocations, then Jackson would not have ended up in the water crisis. So do with that what you will. But what was really helpful about this strategy is I think I was probably more hurt than some of the community members. They were so happy that their voices were centered in the work, that someone was willing to build a legal strategy around their stories and not come to them with a legal strategy that hadn't been baked into their own experiences in the past. And so it was really informative for me as well about ways to ensure that community members are not just a part of the storytelling, but also to help to inform the legal strategy as well. We took this work to internationally, so we talked at the Conference of the Parties US COP that year around water infrastructure issues in Jackson, and so we were able to connect that to communities across the world and help people to understand that water infrastructure issues are happening here in the United States as well. And we also recognize that not everyone's able to go to COP. So we did blogs and we did other ways for people domestically as well as internationally to be able to understand what COP even is. Because for a lot of people, if you're not in the space, you don't know, as well as some next steps. So now the question is, we did all this work, but what do we do now that the landscape is changing? We know that there are fewer federal protections, there's more state and local control. The legal landscape right now, the targeting of certain firms to do work, to have them answer questionnaires. There's a conflation of DEI and environmental justice, which I think is very intentional. And there is less unity in certain spaces where there should be more. And so I think that what's going to be really important for us to do now is to understand that this is also a strategy to burn people out early, and to understand that there's still more work that's going to need to be done, and that we've seen some of the strategies and some of the things that have been brought to community members, but recognizing that there is probably more. There's definitely more that's going to be coming pretty soon, and likely is going to be just as harmful for communities. So to recognize that right now the important thing is for us to be building out where the models that exist, how can we utilize and build out more models across the country? How do we start thinking about judges now? People who were really intentional about getting rid of environmental protections, they were monitoring senior status of judges for years. And we need to be, and there are organizations that are doing this, but folks in the environmental and climate space too, need to be thinking about who's up for senior status and making sure that we have that pipeline that exists. We need to make sure that we're staying united. What I have seen, a lot, especially over the last couple of months, is people are like, this is my area, I know how to do this. And a lot of the unity that allowed for us to get here is now starting to fracture some. So here are my few takeaways and things to remember. That environmental justice is an inherently local issue. Climate and environmental justice are racial justice issues. Watch out for false narratives of environmental protections. To check the power dynamics in decision making. create authentic space for creative and innovative solutions that honor historically excluded communities. And lastly, ask questions and take a stand. Thank you.
Time for one or two quick questions before we go. We have our reception in the lower rotunda. So, are there any questions? There have to be some. I mean, I could ask lots, but I'm always asking questions.
So I thank you so much. This is wonderful and informative, and you're so cheerful. And I feel like in the role that you play, you could be very not happy, but you seem happy, and that comes across it's reassuring. I was going to ask about this idea of coalition building in a divisive time. So you say, some of these, a lot of the unity is becoming fractured. So I don't know if you have any suggestions or tips about how to ensure coalition building, because I think for example, I spoke with someone who worked for the Sierra Club of Black Women. She was like, basically, it's exhausting. Like, these organizations that are so progressive in so many respects for a person of color, they are anti-Black. I don't know. So so I guess my question is, it's already a lot of underlying structures that aren't necessarily inclusive when it comes to folks who work to promote climate justice. I mean, that it's not diverse, it's not necessarily inclusive, it's not culturally aware. That already exists. So now coalition formation and building is even more instrumental, and there's all these external factors that also promote divisiveness. So I don't know what you would suggest. How do we address some of these internal issues, strengthen the internal, morale and ethical stance and anti-racism, while also building coalitions across the board?
Thank you so much for that question, and yes to everything that you're saying, because it exists. And I think that partly what has happened in the past and why it can be so exhausting, particularly for people of color who are in those organizations, is that it's on them to have to highlight when people are being left out, and it's on them to have to highlight when there are equity issues. And so I think part of it is that it's going to take all of us, not just the people of color who are in those infrastructures and in those spaces, to say, does this really need to just be a conservation group conversation, or do we need to make sure that there are other groups who are part of this conversation? Or if a group right now is getting a lot of money from a funder, and it's like, well, we also know that there's some really small EJ groups who are being targeted by this administration who barely have any money. And so how can those groups, potentially participate in more mutual aid types of infrastructure to actually help them to be able to survive as well? So I think that it's going to take that. It's going to take in the coalitions, recognizing that for some groups they're resourced to be able to be a part of those coalitions, and then for some individuals and for some groups, they're doing it because they don't have any other options. If they're not a part of this work, that's it. And so recognizing that people are coming to this space from different perspectives, and that's okay, but also recognizing that who needs to be amplified in those conversations likely are the people who are there because this is their only option, and that the other organizations that are part of it need to be there as a support and not to dictate what that support needs to look like. So once the group says, this is what we need, not to come back and be like, well, we actually think you need this instead. To actually hear what they're saying and try to figure out how to be helpful in that way.
Well, we're going to have to call it here. We're at the bottom of the hour, but please join me again in thanking Aubrey for her remarks. For friends that weren't able to hear, the video of this will be on the website shortly, and please join us in the lower rotunda for a brief reception where we can continue the conversation, and certainly you can speak more with Aubrey. So thank you all, and for the students, Only a few more years of class left. You're almost there.